Montana Territory, 1885. The wind howled across the plains like a vengeful spirit, rattling the windows of the small cabin where Xander Keller had taken refuge from the gathering storm. At 25, he had already seen more of life's cruelties than most men twice his age. The harsh frontier had carved lines into his otherwise youthful face, creating a striking contrast with his clear blue eyes that seemed to hold both innocence and ancient wisdom. "No use fighting it now," Xander muttered to himself, securing the cabin door against the fury building outside. He had planned to reach Helena by nightfall, but the darkening sky and distant thunder had forced him to seek shelter at this abandoned homestead. The life of a drifting cowhand meant learning to read the sky as clearly as tracks in the dirt. Tonight, the sky had warned him to find cover. Xander believed the frontier was no place for putting down roots. His parents had tried. They had believed in the promise of the West, in building something that would last. Their graves, unmarked somewhere in Wyoming territory, stood as testament to the folly of such dreams. Since losing them to a raid when he was 16, Xander had kept moving, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. "A drifter stays alive," he often told himself. "A man who roots gets cut down." It was his creed, his protection against the wilderness both outside and within him. As he settled in for the night, Xander didn't realize that the approaching storm would bring more than rain and lightning. It would bring the very thing he'd spent years avoiding. A chance to heal the wounds he carried, and to discover that even in the harshest places, the human heart could find a home. The rain began as a gentle patter that quickly escalated to a downpour. Xander had just managed to get a small fire going in the cabin's stone hearth when a sound at the door froze him mid-motion. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip. 3 rapid knocks, then silence. "Who's there?" Xander called, positioning himself to the side of the door, gun drawn. "Please," came a female voice almost lost in the storm's fury. "Please help us." The plural caught his attention. Cautiously, Xander opened the door to find a young woman standing there, drenched and shivering, with a small bundle clutched tightly to her chest. Her wide eyes, the color of summer sage, met his with desperate hope. "Thank God," she breathed. "I thought we were done for." Before Xander could respond, she pushed past him into the cabin, revealing that the bundle in her arms was a small child, no more than 2 years old, sleeping despite being soaked to the skin. "Ma'am, Xander began, but stopped when he got a proper look at her. She couldn't have been more than 22. Her long blonde hair, darkened by rain, clung to a face that would have been beautiful even without the flush the cold had brought to her cheeks. She wore a simple blue dress, now sodden and mudded at the hem. "I'm Abigail James," she said, moving directly to the fire. "This is my son, Thomas. Our wagon broke an axle about a mile back. I saw the smoke from your chimney." She was unwrapping the child as she spoke, checking him with careful fingers. "He's so cold." Xander holstered his gun and closed the door. "Xander Keller," he offered, uncomfortable with the sudden intrusion but unable to ignore their need. "Let me get some blankets." He retrieved the spare bedroll from his saddlebags, the only extra covering he had. As he handed it to her, their fingers brushed, and an unexpected jolt passed through him. Abigail seemed not to notice as she quickly wrapped the boy in the dry blanket. "Thank you, Mr. Keller," she said, her voice softening. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "Just Xander is fine," he interrupted, returning to tend the fire. "You're lucky I found this place myself. Not many shelters out here." "Providence, perhaps," she offered with a small smile that transformed her face. Xander looked away. Providence had never done him any favors. "Maybe," he conceded noncommittally, "your husband." "Is he with the wagon?" A shadow passed over Abigail's features. "My husband died last winter, pneumonia. Thomas and I are heading to Helena. My sister lives there." The information hit Xander like a physical blow. Her vulnerability, her courage, the child depending on her. It created complications he hadn't anticipated for a night's shelter from the storm. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said awkwardly. "As am I for whatever shadows I see behind your eyes, mister." "Keller," she replied, catching him off guard with her perceptiveness. Xander turned away, uncomfortable with her insight. "I'll see if there's anything to eat in this place," he said, eager for distance. As he rummaged through the cabin's meager supplies, finding only a few cans of beans left by previous occupants, Xander felt his carefully constructed walls begin to creak. This woman and child represented everything he avoided: responsibility, connection, the danger of caring too much in a world that took without mercy. Yet as the night progressed and the storm raged outside, Xander found himself sharing the beans, his coffee, and eventually, stories of the trail. Abigail listened with genuine interest, occasionally offering glimpses into her own life. Growing up in Pennsylvania, moving west with her husband Daniel's dreams of prosperity, facing the brutal reality of frontier life. "Daniel always said the West would make us rich," she said softly, stroking her sleeping son's hair. "He didn't understand that wealth isn't always measured in gold." Something in her words resonated with Xander, though he pushed the feeling aside. By the time they prepared for sleep, with Abigail and Thomas taking the cabin's narrow bed and Xander making do with his saddle as a pillow near the fire, he had already decided to help them reach Helena before continuing his journey north. It was only practical, he told himself. A woman and child alone on the frontier faced dangers he couldn't in good conscience leave them to handle. It wasn't attachment, it was basic human decency. But as he drifted toward sleep, Xander couldn't deny that for the first time in years, the loneliness that had been his constant companion seemed to have eased, if only for one storm-filled night. Morning brought clear skies and uncomfortable clarity to Xander. In daylight, the momentary connection of the night before felt dangerous. He busied himself with preparing to leave, avoiding Abigail's eyes as she tended to her now awake and curious son. "I'll help you get your wagon fixed," he offered stiffly. "Then I can escort you to Helena." "That's very kind," Abigail replied, her voice gentle but with an undertone of steel that surprised him. "But I don't need charity, Mr. Keller. I can pay for your help." "It's not," he began, then stopped. "All right, but I'm not taking money from a widow with a child." A smile touched her lips. "Then perhaps we can negotiate another arrangement. I'm an excellent cook, and you look like you haven't had a proper meal in some time." Despite himself, Xander found a small smile forming. "That's fair enough." They set out after a simple breakfast, Thomas riding in front of Xander on his horse while Abigail walked beside them. The boy, initially shy, warmed quickly to Xander, babbling in half-formed words and pointing at birds with delighted exclamations. They reached the wagon by mid-morning. The broken axle was beyond repair, but Xander assessed they could salvage enough of Abigail's belongings to continue with what his horse could carry. "We'll have to leave the wagon," he explained, helping her sort through her possessions. "Take only what you need most." Abigail nodded, her practical nature evident in how quickly she prioritized. A small trunk of clothing, a few cherished books, a framed photograph of her late husband, and a worn Bible were among her choices. As Xander loaded these items onto his horse, he caught sight of a small wooden toy, a carved horse, that had fallen from the wagon. He picked it up, brushing off the dirt before handing it to Thomas, who had been watching with solemn eyes. "Horse," the boy exclaimed, clutching the toy with chubby fingers. "That's right," Xander said, surprised by the warmth that spread through him at the child's simple joy. Abigail watched the interaction with an unreadable expression. "He likes you," she observed. "He doesn't warm to many strangers." Xander shrugged uncomfortably. "Kids and horses. They know who to trust, I suppose." "And who do you trust, Xander Keller?" she asked softly. The question caught him unprepared. "My horse," he answered with forced lightness, "and my gun. They've never let me down." Sadness flickered across Abigail's face, but she didn't press further. Instead, she helped him finish securing their belongings, and they began the journey toward Helena, with Thomas sometimes walking, sometimes riding, and Xander increasingly aware of the woman beside him. The road to Helena would take them 3 days at a comfortable pace. 3 days that would change everything Xander thought he knew about himself and the life he had chosen. On that first evening, they made camp near a small creek. While Xander tended to his horse and gathered firewood, Abigail prepared a meal from their provisions that far surpassed the trail fare he was accustomed to. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, savoring the simple but flavorful stew. "My mother," Abigail answered, her 22 years briefly falling away as she smiled at the memory. "She believed a woman should know how to make something from nothing. It served me well out here." As Thomas played nearby, occasionally bringing stones or sticks to show Xander with proud importance, Abigail shared more of her story. How she had met Daniel at 19, married him despite her parents' concerns about his westward ambitions, and followed him first to Kansas, then Montana. I don't regret it, she said, looking at her son. Not even with everything that happened. The frontier teaches you what matters. Xander found himself nodding. It does that, though the lessons can be harsh. Your parents, she asked perceptively. He hesitated, then surprised himself by answering. Raiders, 9 years ago in Wyoming, I was 16. Abigail's hand briefly touched his arm, a gesture of understanding rather than pity. And you've been alone since then. Safer that way, he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. Is it? The question lingered between them, unanswered but resonant, as night settled around their small camp. The following day brought them to a small settlement where they were able to purchase supplies. Xander noticed how people looked at them, a young man, woman, and child traveling together, and made assumptions. For some reason, he didn't correct these misperceptions, and neither did Abigail. As they left the settlement, Abigail walking beside his horse with Thomas on her hip, she said, "They thought we were a family." Xander adjusted his hat. People see what they expect to see. And what do you see when you look at us, Xander? She asked, her direct gaze challenging him. Complications, he answered honestly, and something I can't have. Her expression softened. Perhaps what we think we can't have is sometimes exactly what we need. Before he could respond, Thomas reached toward him with imploring arms. Up, Xander, up. Without thinking, Xander lifted the boy onto the saddle in front of him. The child settled against his chest with perfect trust, and Xander felt something shift inside him, like ground giving way beneath his feet. That night after Thomas had fallen asleep, Abigail and Xander sat by the fire, the vastness of the Montana sky arching above them. She told him about her hopes for Helena, finding work as a seamstress, perhaps eventually opening a small shop. And you, she asked, what awaits you after Helena? Xander poked at the fire with a stick. Cattle drive up north, then winter work at a ranch if I can find it, same as always. Always moving, she observed. Never staying. That's right. Abigail studied him across the flames. Do you never tire of it, the wandering? He hadn't allowed himself to consider the question before. It's what I know, he said finally. That doesn't answer my question. Xander met her gaze. Yes, sometimes I tire of it. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way Xander hadn't allowed himself to be in years. When Abigail reached across to take his hand, he didn't pull away. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For the truth, it's rare out here. Later, lying awake under the stars, Xander confronted the uncomfortable reality that in just 2 days, this woman and her son had begun to challenge everything he believed about survival on the frontier. The walls he had built so carefully were developing cracks, letting in feelings he had long thought buried. The 3rd day of their journey began with a sense of impending loss that Xander couldn't shake. Helena was less than a day's ride away now. Soon he would deliver Abigail and Thomas to her sister's home and continue north as planned. The thought brought none of the usual relief he felt when parting ways with temporary traveling companions. They had been riding for several hours when Xander noticed dust on the horizon behind them. Shading his eyes, he made out riders 4 or 5 moving fast. Trouble, he said, pulling his horse to a stop. Abigail followed his gaze. Bandits. Maybe, or just men in a hurry. Either way, let's not find out. He looked around quickly, spotting a stand of trees near a rocky outcropping. There, we'll wait until they pass. They had just reached the shelter of the trees when the riders came into clear view. 5 men, rough-looking and armed. Xander's instinct screamed danger. Stay here, he whispered to Abigail, who nodded, clutching Thomas close and keeping him quiet with gentle whispers. Xander moved to the edge of the trees, watching as the men slowed, clearly following their trail. His hand moved to his gun. They're looking for someone, Abigail whispered behind him. Or something, Xander agreed, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. One of the riders, a heavy-set man with a bushy beard, pointed toward the trees. They had been spotted. Xander made a split-second decision. Stay hidden, he told Abigail. If anything happens, take my horse and ride for Helena, don't stop. Before she could protest, he stepped out from the trees, his posture casual but alert, hand near his holster. Afternoon, gentlemen, he called. Something I can help you with. The men spread out slightly as they approached, a tactical move that confirmed Xander's suspicions. Might be, said the bearded man, clearly the leader. We're looking for a woman and child. Blonde, pretty, boy about 2 years old. Seen anyone like that? Xander kept his expression neutral. Can't say that I have, not many folks on this road. What's your interest in them? The man's eyes narrowed. Family matter. Her husband's brother sent us to find her. Make sure she and the boy get where they're going safely. It was a lie, and not even a good one. Xander had spent enough time around dangerous men to recognize predators. Well, I wish you luck, he said evenly. But like I said, haven't seen anyone matching that description. The men exchanged glances. Mind if we check your saddlebags? Asked the leader, just to be thorough. Actually, I do mind, Xander replied, his hand now resting openly on his gun. I value my privacy. Tension crackled in the air. Xander counted the odds, 5 against 1, poor odds by any measure, but he had surprise and position on his side. He's hiding something, said one of the other men, a skinny, rat-faced character with a knife scar across one cheek. I say we search him anyway. The leader nodded slowly. I think you're right, Joe. Looks like we might have to insist. What happened next unfolded in seconds. As the leader reached for his gun, Xander drew and fired in one fluid motion. The man toppled from his horse with a look of surprise frozen on his face. The others scrambled for cover, returning fire as Xander ducked back into the trees. Abigail, go, he shouted, firing again to provide covering fire. Instead, she appeared beside him, Thomas clutched to her chest and Xander's rifle in her free hand. I'm not leaving you, she said firmly, passing him the rifle, and I'm not letting them take my son. The determination in her eyes left no room for argument. Together they took position behind a large boulder, Xander alternating between rifle and pistol as he kept the attackers at bay. They after you? He asked during a lull in the firing. Abigail's face was grim. My husband's brother Curtis, he wanted our land claim near Butte. When Daniel died, he tried to force me to marry him. When I refused, he threatened Thomas. Her voice hardened. I left that night. Understanding dawned on Xander. And he sent men to bring you back. She nodded, her eyes never leaving the positions of their attackers. I should have told you, I'm sorry. Before Xander could respond, a bullet splintered the wood near his head. He returned fire, catching one of the men in the shoulder. We need to move, he said, assessing their dwindling ammunition. They're trying to flank us. Abigail pointed to a narrow ravine behind them. Through there, it might lead to higher ground. They made a run for it during the next exchange of gunfire, Xander covering their retreat. The ravine was steep but passable, winding upward through the rocks. Thomas, remarkably, remained quiet, seeming to understand the gravity of the situation despite his young age. As they climbed, Xander realized with growing certainty that these men weren't just hired guns, they were killers. The way they moved, the precision of their shots, their determination. Curtis James hadn't sent them to bring Abigail back. He had sent them to eliminate the obstacles to his claim. They reached a plateau that offered both cover and a view of the surrounding area. 2 of the attackers were visible, moving cautiously through the trees below. The others were out of sight, likely circling around. They're hunting us, Xander said grimly. This isn't about capturing you anymore. Abigail's face paled, but her resolve didn't waver. Then we fight. I won't let them hurt my son. In that moment, looking at her fierce protectiveness, Xander felt something fundamental shift within him. For years, he had convinced himself that attachment was weakness, that caring too deeply was a liability in the harsh reality of the frontier. But watching Abigail, her courage, her unwavering love for her child, he realized that perhaps it was the opposite. Perhaps it was in connection, in having something worth fighting for, that true strength was found. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near them, ending the moment of revelation. Xander positioned himself at the edge of their cover, sighting down the rifle. 2 coming up the east side, he murmured. I can see 1 more circling north. That leaves 1 unaccounted for. Abigail checked the pistol Xander had given her. What's the plan? We hold them off until dark, he replied. Then we make a break for Helena. It's only about 10 miles now. She nodded, determination evident in every line of her body. As she shifted Thomas to a more secure position, Xander caught sight of something that made his blood run cold, the glint of a rifle barrel from the ridge above them. Down, he shouted, lunging toward Abigail and Thomas as a shot cracked through the air. Pain exploded in his left shoulder as the bullet found its mark. He fell against Abigail, who caught him with surprising strength, pulling him behind a boulder as more shots peppered their position. "Xander," her voice seemed to come from far away. "Xander, stay with me." He blinked, fighting through the haze of pain. "I'm all right," he managed, "just winged me." It was worse than that, and they both knew it. Blood soaked his shirt, running down his arm in alarming quantity. Abigail tore a strip from her petticoat, binding the wound with quick, efficient movements. Her face was calm, but fear showed in her eyes. "Can you shoot?" she asked. Xander tested his right arm. "With this one, yes," he grimaced. "But we're surrounded now, 4 directions." The gravity of their situation settled over them. The plateau that had seemed defensible was now a trap. Night was still hours away, and Xander was losing blood despite Abigail's makeshift bandage. Thomas, sensing the tension, began to whimper. Abigail soothed him with soft words, her eyes never leaving Xander's face. "There must be a way," she whispered. Xander surveyed their position, mind racing despite the pain clouding his thoughts. There was one possibility, desperate, dangerous, but possibly their only chance. "There is," he said finally. "But you won't like it." He explained his plan quickly. He would create a diversion, drawing their fire and attention, while Abigail and Thomas escaped down the western slope where the terrain was steepest but offered the most cover. "No," she said immediately, "I won't leave you." "Abigail," he said, taking her hand, "Thomas needs you. This is his best chance, our best chance." Tears filled her eyes. "They'll kill you." "Maybe," he acknowledged. "But I'm pretty hard to kill." He attempted a smile that turned into a grimace as pain lanced through his shoulder. Abigail looked at him for a long moment, then leaned forward and kissed him, a brief, fierce meeting of lips that conveyed everything words could not. When she pulled back, her decision was written on her face. "We'll meet in Helena," she said, her voice steady. "At the church on the main street. I'll wait for you." Xander nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He checked his guns, counting the remaining ammunition. 6 shots in the pistol, 4 in the rifle. It would have to be enough. "Wait for my signal," he said. "Then go, don't look back." Abigail gathered Thomas close, positioning herself for the descent. "I'll see you in Helena," she said, as if saying it with enough conviction would make it true. Xander moved to the eastern edge of the plateau, took a deep breath, and began firing, deliberate, well-placed shots designed to force the attackers to take cover rather than return immediate fire. "Now," he shouted, continuing his barrage as Abigail slipped over the western edge with Thomas securely in her arms. The attackers responded with a hail of bullets, forcing Xander to duck behind a boulder. He waited until he was sure Abigail had enough of a head start, then began moving from cover to cover, drawing fire away from the direction she had gone. His plan worked, perhaps too well. The men converged on his position, cutting off potential escape routes. Xander fought with the desperation of a man who had found something worth living for just in time to lose it. 2 more of the attackers fell to his bullets before his ammunition ran out. As the remaining 2 closed in, Xander prepared for a final stand, drawing his hunting knife. The first man rushed him with a wild cry. Despite his weakened state, Xander sidestepped the charge, using the man's momentum to send him crashing into the rocks. The impact was fatal, a sickening crack followed by stillness. But the maneuver left Xander exposed to the last attacker, the rat-faced man called Joe. He tackled Xander to the ground, the knife falling from Xander's grasp as they grappled in the dirt. With his injured shoulder, Xander was at a disadvantage. The man pinned him, hands closing around his throat. "Curtis said to bring the woman back alive," Joe snarled, his face inches from Xander's. "Didn't say nothing about you." Spots danced before Xander's eyes as his lungs burned for air. His good arm scrambled in the dirt, searching desperately for a weapon, a rock, anything. His fingers closed around a sharp stone. With the last of his strength, Xander brought it crashing against his attacker's temple. The man slumped, his grip loosening just enough for Xander to heave him aside and gulp precious air into his starved lungs. For several minutes Xander lay there, consciousness wavering. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the plateau. He had to move to follow Abigail to make sure she and Thomas reached safety. With monumental effort, he pushed himself to his feet, swaying as dizziness threatened to overwhelm him. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage on his shoulder, and fresh rivulets ran down his arm. One step at a time, he told himself, one foot in front of the other. He began the descent down the western slope, following the path Abigail had taken. The going was treacherous. Loose shale and steep drops made each step a challenge, especially in his weakened state. Twice he fell, reopening his wound and adding fresh cuts to his collection of injuries. But the thought of Abigail and Thomas kept him moving. They had awakened something in him that he had thought long dead: hope, the possibility of connection, of a life beyond mere survival. Night had fallen completely by the time he reached the base of the slope. Helena was still miles away, and Xander's strength was fading rapidly. He stumbled along the road, using the stars to guide his direction, each step an act of will. He wasn't sure how long he had been walking when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Instinctively, he moved to the side of the road, ready to hide if necessary. But as the riders came into view, relief washed over him. It was a patrol of lawmen, likely from Helena. Abigail must have reached help and sent them back for him. "Here," he called, his voice a rasp. "Over here." The lead rider spotted him and signaled to the others. As they surrounded him, Xander managed one question before his legs gave way beneath him. "Abigail and Thomas, are they safe?" The widow and her boy: "Yes, sir, they're safe in town. She was mighty insistent we come looking for you." Satisfaction and profound relief were the last things Xander felt before darkness claimed him. He woke to the unfamiliar sensation of a soft bed beneath him and clean bandages around his shoulder. Sunlight streamed through a window, and the sounds of a bustling town filtered in from outside. For a moment, disorientation gripped him, until a familiar voice brought everything into focus. "Good morning." Abigail sat beside the bed, her hands busy with some mending. She looked tired but unharmed, her blonde hair neatly pinned back, her green eyes warm with relief. "Thomas?" Xander asked, his voice rough. "With my sister," she assured him, completely enchanted by her cat. Xander tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his shoulder. Abigail moved quickly to help him, arranging pillows behind his back. "The doctor says you're lucky," she said. "The bullet went clean through. No major damage, though you lost a lot of blood." "And those men won't be troubling you again," he finished, "but Curtis might send others." Abigail's expression hardened. "The sheriff has telegraphed the authorities in Butte. Curtis James will face justice for what he's done." She hesitated. "And I've decided not to stay in Helena." Xander felt an inexplicable pang of disappointment. "Where will you go?" "That depends," she said carefully, "on you." "On me?" She set aside her mending. "The sheriff told me something interesting. There's unclaimed land, good land, about 15 miles east of here, enough for a small ranch. He said a man with experience could make something of it." Xander looked at her, understanding slowly dawning. "Abigail, I know what you believe, Xander," she said, taking his hand. "That attachment is dangerous. That staying in one place makes you vulnerable, and perhaps you're right." Her eyes held his, steady and sure. "But these past days have shown us both, I think, that there are things worth risking everything for." She was right, and Xander knew it. The beliefs that had guided him for 9 years had been shaken to their core. In protecting Abigail and Thomas, in fighting for them, he had found purpose beyond mere survival. He had found something to live for. "I'm not asking for promises," Abigail continued. "Only that you consider the possibility that running isn't the only way to stay alive. That sometimes it's in staying, in building something that we truly live." Xander looked out the window at the town of Helena, at the mountains beyond, at the vast Montana sky. For years he had viewed such beauty only as a backdrop for his wandering, never as a home. "I don't know how to stay," he admitted finally. "I've spent so long moving on." Abigail squeezed his hand. "Then perhaps it's time to learn." The weeks of Xander's recovery became a time of transformation. As his body healed, so too did something deeper within him, the wound of loss that had driven him to isolation for so many years. Thomas became his shadow, bringing him small treasures: a peculiarly shaped rock, a feather, a wildflower, and sitting beside him as Xander whittled more wooden animals to join the horse. The boy's innocent trust was a gift Xander had never expected to receive. Abigail's sister Rebecca welcomed him into her home without question, treating him as family from the first day. Through her, Xander glimpsed what Abigail had come from: a warm, generous spirit unbroken by frontier hardships. And Abigail herself, In her, Xander found both strength and tenderness. She never pushed, never demanded, simply offered possibilities that he had long denied himself. Together, they visited the land the sheriff had mentioned. It was good country, a valley protected by hills with a year-round creek running through it. Enough grass for cattle, enough timber for building, room to grow. Standing on a rise overlooking the valley, Abigail slipped her hand into his. "What do you see?" she asked. For the first time in years, Xander allowed himself to envision a future. A cabin built by his own hands, cattle grazing on the hillsides, perhaps someday fields of wheat or corn. Thomas growing tall and strong in the clean mountain air. And Abigail, always Abigail, her presence making a house into a home. "Possibilities," he answered finally. "Things I stopped believing in a long time ago." She leaned against him, her warmth a counterpoint to the autumn chill. "They were always there, waiting for you to see them again." 2 months after the attack on the plateau, Xander and Abigail were married in the small church in Helena. Thomas stood proudly beside them, his small hand clutching the wooden horse that had become his cherished possession. Rebecca wept joyful tears, and even the sheriff attended, pleased to see the young couple finding happiness after such trials. By early spring, their cabin on the new homestead was complete. It was modest but solid, built to withstand Montana winters and to grow as their needs changed. Xander had purchased a small herd of cattle with his savings from years of cowhand work and had ambitious plans for breeding quality stock. On their first night in the completed cabin, after Thomas had been tucked into bed in his own small room, Xander and Abigail sat before the fire, content in the home they had created together. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Very," she replied, nestling closer. "Though there is one thing." "What's that?" Abigail rose and crossed to the table where a lamp sat unlit, the room illuminated only by the fire's glow. "Would you light the lamp?" she asked. Xander moved to do as she requested, but paused when she placed her hand over his, stopping him. "Actually," she said softly, "I would rather you didn't." Their eyes met in the firelight, and Xander understood. She turned away slightly, her fingers going to the buttons of her dress. "I have scars," she whispered. "From Thomas's birth, they aren't pretty." Xander gently turned her to face him. "We all have scars, Abigail. Some visible, some hidden." He touched her cheek. "They're part of what brought us here to this moment." Tears glistened in her eyes. "You understand." "I do," he said simply. In the gentle glow of the firelight, they found each other anew, their scars, both physical and emotional, not barriers but bridges connecting their shared experiences. In Abigail's arms, Xander finally understood that the frontier's harshness was only part of the truth. There was also this tenderness, belonging, the miracle of finding home in another person's heart. The lamp remained unlit, a symbol of their acceptance of each other's whole selves, imperfections and all. Later, as Abigail slept beside him, Xander gazed at the ceiling of the home they had built, listening to the night sounds of the Montana wilderness. For 9 years, he had believed that the frontier had taught him one lesson, that attachment led only to loss, that caring too deeply was a weakness that could destroy you. Now he understood there was a deeper truth. Yes, the frontier could take, it could be cruel and unforgiving, but it could also give connection, purpose, family, the very things he had convinced himself he could never have again. Outside, an owl called, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a warm glow over the sleeping forms of his wife, and in the next room his son, for Thomas had become his in all the ways that mattered. Tomorrow would bring work, challenges, the endless tasks of building a life on the frontier. But it would also bring moments of joy, Thomas's laughter, Abigail's smile, the satisfaction of creating something lasting in a place where he had once believed nothing could endure. Xander Keller, who had spent years drifting, had finally found his true north, not in a place, but in the hearts of those who had taught him that love wasn't weakness but the greatest strength of all.